Francesco?
Yes, sorry. Sorry, I was getting ready. Thank you so much. And thank you even more than yesterday. Yesterday was a surprise. If you came back, you're repeating the mistake as we were taught in school in Italy. Errare humanum, perseverare diabolicum. To make a mistake is human. To stick on a mistake is devilish. So I thank you for this. And today, as we announced about the grand international situation surrounding China in this moment. It's very complicated again, and as you saw yesterday, I'm trying to go quickly through history to try to figure out where we are and why we are in this present predicament, and what kind of predicament is in China now. We know of the trade war, we know of the friction, and people think, okay, this friction will go on, will not go on, there will be peace, there will be war, there is Hong Kong, there is Taiwan, but where does it all come from? In my mind, the whole picture, to understand fully where we are, we have to take a very distant date, 1453. That is more than half a millennium ago. In 1453, finally, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, with Mehmed II, took over Constantinople and put an end to the Byzantine Empire, the heir of the Roman Empire. And the Turks started an expansion, a westward expansion in the Mediterranean. But most importantly, they locked the trade that had been going on for centuries, since the Roman Empire, between the Mediterranean and what were called the Indies, the Far East, India, and what is now China. This trade was extremely important. Marco Polo, we know, brought riches and money from China to Europe. There was silk, there were the spices. Spices was extremely important because it helped the food and therefore the very surviving of the people, because now we have refrigerators. At the time we didn't have refrigerators. You needed spices. Spices helped preservation of food. So the Turks locked and monopolized this trade, and therefore the Italians, who had been trading with the India and China, and the Spaniards, who were also part of this trade, or people, I would say, from the Iberic Peninsula, started looking for alternative routes. The Portuguese tried to go around Africa. Columbus, as we know, from Genoa, but financed by the Spanish, who were also allied of Genoa, because we tend to forget that, went bold and said, we have to cross through the ocean and go to America. They discovered America, and that changed the whole trade. And for centuries, in fact, trade with Asia went around the Mediterranean. It's very interesting. In 1571, a very important year, was the same year when the Spanish occupied and established Manila as an important trade port with China and with India, and started the occupation of the Philippines, kicking away the Chinese traders who were there. And also in 1571, eventually and finally, the Genoese and Spanish alliance managed to check the advance of the Turks in Lepanto, in the Battle of Lepanto, off the coast of modern Albania in 1571. And this was the first time that the long-term advancement of the Ottoman Empire was checked. It was a stalemate, but it was enough to give time to the Spanish to concentrate their efforts not on the Mediterranean, not against the Turks, but on China. They started trading with China. They bought silk and vases, porcelain, China. The name comes from this, in exchange for silver. This trade saved the Ming Empire, which was in a financial crisis. There was a lot of Mexican silver, silver from Peru, flowing into China in exchange for this new advanced industrial production. But you know, some 50 years after, the situation again changed. China was facing the 30 Years' War, war with England, war with the Dutch, war with the northern princes of Germany and Scandinavia. Therefore, they stopped the trade with silver with the Ming Empire. Rapidly, the Ming Empire, in the space of some 10 years, there was a huge inflation. Prices quadrupled, simply also because normal trade inside China was in copper, but taxes were paid in silver. So people started, the economy was growing, needed more silver. There was no silver. People started hoarding silver. The prices of silver skyrocketed. There was the rebellion of Li Zicheng, who brought down the Ming Emperor. A Ming general opened the gates and let the Manchu come in, and the Manchu reconquered China. They established their own empire and their own dynasty. This was 1644. Very interesting, 1644. And it actually took a few decades for the Manchu to establish themselves as real rulers of China. It was not all of a sudden. But what is interesting to me is that 200 years after, exactly 200 years after, in 1841, China again faced a similar challenge. This time, it was against the English, and it was the first Opium War. Basically, the issue was the same: trade. They had difficulties in handling trade. We can go on that. The Chinese refused to import opium, maybe also for the right reasons, but they didn't have anything to replace the demand of the Western countries of England, that now was of tea leaves. Tea leaves was very important. No longer silk or porcelain, but tea leaves. So lots of tea leaves, lots of silver. Around the year 1840s, China accumulated about 70% of all the global silver. So basically all the silver of the world was flowing into China. Nobody had any money left. And this crisis was again brewing since the 20s and 30s. 200 years after, where are we? Here, now. in a very similar situation, exactly 200 years after. What is the situation again? Trade. I don't know. It's very interesting to me. And in all these three instances, the common denominator is the difficulty of China to get into a global trade which is not managed by China, but is managed by different countries. The first time were the Spanish, the second time were the English, now are the Americans. They, in all these three instances, in all these three instances,
you are not allowed.
Not allowed to be late?
No, that's the rule with students. When you are later than 10 minutes, then you should come next lecture.
I'll give him a private tutoring.
I was taking care of our guests.
So you are excused.
So 300, in 3 times, 400 years apart, we have similar instances, very similar. Difficulties, China's difficulties in handling trade managed by different countries, in all 3 instances centered around the American continent. Centered about the American continent, in all 3 instances. Money comes from the American continent. Of course, in one time it was money coming from Mexico, and another time was money coming from England, but also involved in global trade with cotton, and the third time from the United States, which we now call it simply America. So this is the historical background that also tells us a historical difficulty. China has a problem getting out of its skin, thinking in a way different from what it is now. I think anyway that China is very different from what China was in 1640s or 1840s. But let's go back to the present time. So this, and then after I'll ask you for some of your opinion and advice. The starting point is the same as yesterday: accession into WTO. What China should do or should not do to get into the World Trade Organization, which was set up or initiated by the United States at the end of the Cold War. There were some agreements, there was some promises, there was a lot of give and take, but eventually there was an agreement. But most importantly, from the outside point of view, yesterday we tried to look at things how they looked from inside China. From outside China, some people started thinking in the United States, but also in Europe, that, well, you Chinese agreed to the rules of the global world, but you know what? You actually have a closed market. You have a closed market because you didn't allow the devaluation of the renminbi, which was a very important issue. So you don't allow the devaluation of the renminbi, therefore you are threatening and undermining the old financial order. Since you don't accept the global financial order, maybe I have to use force. This is the time of 2001, the Bush administration. I'm sure most of you don't remember, but it was a very sensitive case. April 1st, Fool's Day, 2001, a surveillance plane and a US surveillance plane clashed with a Chinese fighter. The Chinese fighter was downed. The surveillance plane crash landed on the island of Hainan, and a big political and diplomatic crisis ensued, and tension, bilateral military tension, became very high in the next few months. Some people thought we were on the verge of war, including me. I was really scared. At the time, I was a journalist in Beijing, talking with a lot of Chinese friends, with some American friends, you know. Things looked pretty dim. But there was 9/11, the huge terrorist attack in New York, and priorities in the United States went into a different direction, totally different direction. So the China problem was not a real problem. The real threat is terrorist threat, the Middle East, and stuff like that. So this also led the Americans to get, for the first time, really involved in Central Asia and the Middle East. The United States started occupying or establishing their presence in Afghanistan in 2002. The same year they went into Iraq. They thought things were easy. They got mixed up in Iraq and things got terribly wrong, as we know. But for a few years, quite a few years, the American strategic attention was diverted from China, which was China since the late 90s, 2001, to the Middle East, Central Asia. And in this meantime, we said yesterday there was this great chaos of the financial crisis in 2008, which was, how can we put it, misappreciated in China. They got priority wrongs. They thought America was down, and in the year 2012, 2013, the Chinese launched their own initiative, their own Belt and Road Initiative, which also was moving towards Central Asia and the Middle East, where the Americans were failing. So they started moving, they reached out to Europeans, and they moved independently from the United States. It was the first grand strategic initiative from China. How can we be independent of the United States, which de facto changed the political order the United States thought it had inherited after the Cold War. So from the point of view of some Americans, this was a direct challenge to the US order. So not only trade, not only economy, not only finance, but also a strategic, geopolitical, massive challenge. Belt and Road Initiative, which, not dissimilarly from other American initiatives, had a strategic arm, but also a trade arm, because it made more sense to have a train or a road trading directly from China to the Mediterranean, bypassing the American continent, which, as we have seen, had been the center of trade and economy for the past half millennium. So I would stop here because we are at a sensitive moment, and then I'll go back to some other places, but I will ask you to raise points, to ask for questions. Yes, please.
About the Belt and Road Initiative.
Can you tell me your name?
Oh, sorry. I'm Bharatwaj. I'm from India.
Okay.
This is about the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes.
So we all know what was the supposed, intentions behind this thing. But can you give us your thoughts on what could have actually been running in the minds of the Chinese for about this initiative? Your opinion.
Yeah. I would say I would challenge your first section. We are not sure about what really is in their minds. If we were sure, we wouldn't be here. As far as I know, there were different opinions. This Belt and Road Initiative, which was not initially called Belt and Road, was called initially New Silk Road, because I think it was more obvious. At first, they thought of involving the United States. First, they thought we should not have it because it challenges Russia or the Soviet Union, because it will go through Central Asia, which was the preserve of power of Russia. So we should keep a good relationship with Russia. We shouldn't go there. And after the Americans moved to Afghanistan and Iraq, especially in the first years, the Chinese cooperated very actively in intelligence and assistance with the Americans in Afghanistan, because they had quite a lot of information, also through cooperation with Pakistan, as you, I'm sure, were aware. So there was a lot of cooperation in the first years, and some Chinese were playing with the ideas of a new Silk Road, but they didn't think that this should be the way. Things started changing after the financial crisis of 2008, because, as we discussed yesterday, the Chinese felt America is down. They are making a mess in Afghanistan, Iraq is falling apart, Russia is not very trustworthy. In 2008, very important, during the Beijing Olympics, just the day of the Beijing Olympics, Putin attacked Georgia and carved Abkhazia and some other slices of Georgia as independent. So it was the first real military action of Russia after the Cold War. And so the Chinese were thinking, Russia is concentrating and is in the West. Russia cannot be maybe too trustworthy. We can move in. And so after the year 2009, 2010, especially 2010, when when the Americans raised the South China Sea, and so the Chinese felt, okay, that this part of the world, we have a lot of pressure, from all these countries, which they think maybe we can move westward, which makes also a lot of sense for our own development. And so they started developing. And they thought, we want the Americans on board. They went to the Americans. The first visit, as far as I know, was to the Americans, but the way in which they presented themselves, as far as I know, didn't make the Americans happy. The Americans said, we are not on board, and then they went around other countries, and so there was a lot of soul searching. And I think in a way there still is a lot of soul searching in China about the Belt and Road Initiative, especially after the friction with the United States. Yes?
Yes, so you mentioned that we don't really know what's going on in the heads of some of these politicians, but can you say a few words about what caused the more stronger assertiveness in terms of Chinese foreign policy? And it's also interesting that they're also using a combination of mostly soft power, but there's also a clear harder edge to some of their initiatives.
What is the harder edge?
The South China Sea being more building up these islands in the Strait,
Okay.
being
Okay.
creating islands that are contentious.
Yeah. Very good point. This would deserve a few hours of discussion. Let me try to be brief. I think that if we have to pinpoint one single element in pushing a greater assertiveness, it was the feeling that America was failing. Was failing because two reasons, basically the financial crisis, and we talked about it yesterday, but also the military and political failure in Central Asia and in Iraq, and with the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, which was one of the few cases successful, the failure in Libya, the failure in Egypt, where first Mubarak was toppled, then the Muslim Brotherhood went to power, and eventually al-Sisi, backed by Israel and the US, came back to power and arrested the Muslim Brotherhood. So, and then Syria. So all these things made Chinese think, okay, United States is on decline, is losing steam, so we can go for our own development. And they felt also threatened because of two things. They thought these Jasmine revolutions eventually could end up in China, Syria. First we toppled Syria, then they topple Iran, and then eventually it will happen in China too. And in fact, there was some ground, it was not just theory, because Obama was the first to announce the pivot to Asia in 2010. Very important, the pivot to Asia, because now we all blame how Trump is going to war, but the first really to move the pivot, the strategic pivot of the United States to Asia was Obama. So it's a long-term push and drive. Yes?
You said that this increased assertiveness of the Chinese on the world is also a result of seeing that the US was weakened. No? But this had already happened before. If you think at the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in the 70s, the US had just come out not very well from the Vietnam War. The financial system based on the dollar had collapsed in 71, so it was a similarly very weak point. Weak militarily because of Vietnam, and financially because of the end of the Bretton Woods system. No? And then, I don't know why, but then there was a coincidence that Russia decided to invade Afghanistan. But then now, 50 years later, the US but it's not, who disappeared was the Soviet Union, not the US.
Absolutely. If I may say, this is the real point. The Chinese, on and on again, for 500 years, 3 times starting, my first example was in 1640, and then 1840, and now, these times, always with an interval of 200 years, they misunderstand the Western world, and they, in this case, this is the biggest case, and the smallest case.
My fault that I'm late. What happened in 1640?
1640, there was a financial Chinese Ming Dynasty fell because of the Spanish stop of the silver trade, and and they got it wrong. And again, I think you're right. As the Russians misunderstood the depth of the crisis of the United States, or the lack of depth, they thought 71 they put down Bretton Woods system, they are being defeated in the Vietnam War, there is revolution in the American university, revolution everywhere, so United States is on the verge of collapse. It's like, because I think there is a problem, authoritarian systems have difficulties understanding the resilience and the elasticity of democratic systems. This is a very interesting and very deep issue. If we look at the history of the Roman Empire, we see they are under constant crisis. Wars between emperors and emperors, challengers are constant. And yet, the Roman Empire, from the Republic until the fall, lasted almost 2,000 years. Conversely, if you look at Chinese history is much more stable, there is greater peace, but each dynasty lasts 200-300 years, 100 years. Much shorter period of time, greater peace, but then when there is a crisis, there is no resilience, or less resilience, because the systems are different in a way. And I think there was a mistake from the Russians. There was a misjudgment in China about the depth of the crisis in the US.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
At the same time, it seems that even we Western people don't understand very well the resilience of the Chinese system,
yes,
because we called, I think, already many times unsustainable,
right,
the current Chinese development, because it's based on, let's say, it's an export-led growth,
right,
which cannot last, therefore it has to
right,
transform into something more based on domestic demand. We see mounting local government debt,
right,
the banking industry being full of bad debt and so on, but still they are there.
right.
So therefore, maybe it's difficult to understand each other. So that's my conclusion, rather than putting the blame on the Chinese as with respect to the
absolutely,
American
absolutely. Let me answer. It's true. It's so true what you say. There is a huge resilience which is underestimated time and again by the United States also. And in fact, to support your point, there are two instances in which the Westerns, but even the Chinese, underestimated the resilience of the system. It took 70 years and 70 million people dead in the 19th century to bring down the Manchu dynasty, because between 1841 and 1911, when the Qing dynasty actually went down, was 70 years. There was the Taiping rebellion, there was the Bai rebellion in Yunnan, there was the rebellion in Gansu, also the Muslim rebellion in Gansu. All in all, some 70 million people, more than 20% of people died in these wars, in these terrible wars, and yet the dynasty was still there. So the system is extremely resilient. And there is another instance during the Great Leap Forward in 1960, exactly 60 years ago. The Taiwanese rightly said, China is starving, people are dying, and in fact we now know that between some 30 million people died, between 30 to 60 million people died. So again, the biggest starvation in the history of humanity. They thought it will be easy to bring it down. They sent troops through Yunnan, in the South China, through Burma, Thailand, northern border Thailand, where they had some forces still there after 49. India started a war in 1962, on a border war in Tibet. Again, very weak point. In 1959, there was a rebellion. The Dalai Lama fled to India. All the Tibetan population allegedly was anti-Chinese. In both cases, the Chinese were under greatest duress, managed to overcome easily these attacks. Easily. What is also very interesting is not they didn't make it in the most difficult time, the poorest moment. They managed to fend off 2 attacks. One by Taiwanese, supported by United States, another one by India, which was more independently moving. So yes, there is a huge resilience of the Chinese system, which we would be naive to underestimate. China is not the Soviet Union. It's stronger, it's more sophisticated, and comes from a different history. The Soviet Union is part of our history. It's part of the Byzantine history. It's the third Rome. Moscow is the third Rome. They are Orthodox, Christians. Chinese is a different world, and also different sets of value follow China.
Oh yeah, so I just want to make a few comments regarding the identification of resilience between the authoritarian regime and the democratic regime. Well, it's just my opinion for what it's worth, but I'd say the resilience of authoritarian regime, like any form of, whether it be a kingdom or a territory, whatever, it's measured in terms of control of its citizenry, while the democratic regime is measured in support of citizenry. So by their very nature, the democratic regime supports the competition like internally within the democratic regime for the support. So competition is built in, and competition does not necessarily mean that the system itself is regularly down. However, in the authoritarian regime, it is geared towards preventing competition for control, because if there is a competition, that means there is an instability that threatens the regime itself. So there is this different point of view where, as you said, like Vietnam War and Bretton Woods and all that, it's only while that's only signaling the start of another competition within the democratic system. If in the eyes of authoritarian regime, it signals weakness, as it to them suggests the lack of control. But on the other hand, well, I argue that the people intuitively are more, let's say, more comfortable with the authoritarian regime, because I would argue that democracy is something that is learned. So you need some form of educational background for the citizenry to want democratic regime after the fall of one authoritarian regime. So that's where we underestimate the resilience of the
Right. This, I think, is a very interesting point. Very, but this is, how can I put it? This would be a course in itself. If Bocconi hires me, we can do political comparativity or whatever. But from just the effect, looking at the effect, why is one is more resilient and the other one is less resilient, etc. Again, this would be part of a future course, which I'm sure Bocconi will hire me for. But from the effect point of view, I would say, yes, the Chinese are underestimating the resilience of the United States, but the United States, or the Western countries, I would say the Western countries, has been consistent in underestimating the resilience of the Chinese state, be it under the Manchu dynasty or the Communist Party in the hardest and harshest moment. So this, as a fact, is very interesting to me. Why the Chinese is so resilient? This is a very not covered path. Why democracies are resilient? Plenty of studies, a lot of, but why China is more resilient? And is China just an authoritarian system? I would have my own doubts, because also we have the constant that, yes, the Communist Party is resilient, but so was the Manchu dynasty. So perhaps we are looking at something different here.
Wouldn't an answer be simple-minded? Confucius?
Simple-minded?
Simple-minded.
No, but this is a very big question, very big question. I honestly put a lot of work on that, but let's not do it.
Okay.
Why? And I've written extensively about it, but is Confucius? Confucius is the code word for anything that comes from China. So it is tantamount. I don't know. Confucius, everything and nothing.
No, there are studies, comparative growth studies, that tend to associate, for instance, the high saving rate that you see in China as related to more patience, which is somehow related
right.
to
my concern about this,
very simple-minded again, but then
right.
some data are supporting of this.
It's very big, I think. My thing is that this is looking at China from the outside, without its history, without the knowledge of what is Confucius. If you ask 20 Chinese will give you 20 different answers on Confucius. And Confucius, we know, it changed. If you look at, I spent my first 10 years of studying Confucius and its enemies. Mozart, my father was his enemy, was his first enemy. So it's very, I would say it's very complicated. I would say in a short, to give you a very short sample, but I'll send you a more complicated essay through. It is the structure of the state. The structure of the Chinese state is very complex, very different from our state, and very resilient and consistent through ages, and it has been improving. It has been improving. And the communist state is an improvement on the imperial system, which was already very effective. The communist system is still more effective. So we have here an improvement of systems, which is Chinese. In a way, then Confucius is right, but just to give it a name. Let me jump back on the historic thread, and shortly after 2012, 2013, the Chinese launched the Belt and Road Initiative. We are in 2014, very interesting year. We have two very important historical events in 2014 which have effect even today. One was, and let's start with that, the annexation of Crimea by Russia. So Russia started a clash with Ukraine, annexed Crimea, started projecting itself on the Black Sea and on the Mediterranean. So Russia was no longer a second-rate adversary, it was a first-rate adversary, because it was again moving into the Mediterranean, the backyard of Europe, the United States, challenging Ukraine, which was backed again by the United States. And so people in the United States who were thinking we should challenge primarily China, started thinking maybe Russia is also still a very big enemy. But also in 2014, there was an event which touched on the raw nerve of China, which was Occupy Central, the first movement in Hong Kong challenging Chinese rule in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is very central to the Chinese power and global reach because, as we know, Chinese currency is not fully convertible, but the Hong Kong dollar is. So Hong Kong dollar and the market, the free market in Hong Kong works as a kind of safety valve between the closed market in China and the open market in the world. So a challenge to the stability and welfare of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong market is a direct challenge to the lifeline and the balance of power and the balance of economy in China. However, these two challenges were met differently. China managed to rein in this movement, this Occupy Central movement. It stopped, and they thought this problem goes away. There is no problem anymore. They forgot about it. Russia started building up, and there was a debate in the United States, shall we take on both Russia and China at the same time, or shall we take on China as first, Russia as second? In 2016, Trump represented the second voice. Russia is important, but actually not very important. We can deal with Putin, but actually China is our main goal, main target. Possibly Hillary Clinton was more on the other side. We have to challenge both Russia and China. And then we are in 2019. 2019, we have again a big movement in Hong Kong, much bigger than the one in 2016. No way to rein in. It has been going on since May last year. It's still on. But most importantly, this movement in Hong Kong now is kindling a fire in Taiwan. Taiwan is very important. Before May, then candidate President Tsai Ing-wen, the lady Tsai Ing-wen, was, according to opinion polls, close to lose the elections, which were held on January 11th this year. But Tsai Ing-wen and the Taiwan people got scared of what was happening in Hong Kong. To put it very bluntly and very simply, if Beijing was treating Hong Kong like that, imagine what they would do to rebellious Taiwan. So people got scared. They didn't believe in one country, two system anymore, and so they voted back in President Tsai Ing-wen. At the same time, we know that trade war between China and the US has been moving up, has been escalating until the truce which was signed on January 15th. I think you are right. There was a misunderstanding in the United States. I think the Trump administration got into this kind of squabble with China, thinking very simply, it will be simple. We just push. They will give us what we want, and we will get on with our lives. They didn't understand that China would resist. Actually, even more, even something before. at first China didn't even understand what the Americans were asking, didn't believe what the Americans were asking. They thought, you know, they are just asking, but we will give them something and they will be happy. Around June 28, they started believing, okay, this is something serious. It's something more than we thought. But they didn't give up. They are starting circling the wagons, as the Americans were putting, thinking straight ahead, what shall we do? And in this time, the Americans were caught wrong-footed because they thought the Chinese wouldn't resist. They were resisting. They are resisting. In fact, today's New York Times says, well, you know, it was an ill-conceived strategy. Now the Chinese are starting building their own technology, delinking, decoupling their own technology, their own chip making from the chip making from the American technology. So they are developing an alternative technology, just as the Soviets were. The New York Times, it says the Trump strategy with China was too naive, was wrong. We are making things worse. We are not making things well. I don't want to go into the debate whether it's right or wrong, but what is important is that at first there was a naive view of the United States, in the United States, that China would be some kind of pushover. It isn't. It is complex, resilient, strong. It won't be easy. Now there is a convergence. In this moment there is a convergence of interest for a truce. Trump has a more tactical view on the truce. He wants to be re-elected. He needs peace. He doesn't need a trade war. He needs the economy to move up, and therefore he doesn't want a full-blown trade war. The Chinese perhaps have a more strategic view of this truce. We have 1 year more. We can prepare. We underestimated the challenge from the United States. Now we will prepare well enough because a real threat, a real clash will come sometime next year. So here we are, plus the Taiwan issue. And after Taiwan, I will open the floor again. Taiwan issue. What is the interest of Taiwan? Taiwan now has an opening, very interesting opening, because now in the middle of this truce, this tension, she objectively, independently from her own, I don't know, she didn't tell me, but you know, objectively, nobody talks to me, not Xi Jinping, not Tsai Ing-wen, not Trump, but objectively, it's very interesting to know what is objectively there. She has a window of opportunity to push her radical agenda, because now, if she pushes now, she has the ears and hearts of the American and the Western world, which are tense about Hong Kong, are worried about the trade war. If she lets it slip this moment, the moment will move away, might move away. The Chinese from Beijing, who are very strategic, are already moving in Taiwan, they could take control of Taiwan society, Taiwan economy, so, you know, to Taiwan society could have less of a leeway with China.
So you've been pushing this idea that Taiwan has this unique opportunity, and so the obvious thing that the new president, re-elected president, could do is call a referendum for independence.
That might be, it's not the only thing, but there is this window of opportunity.
If that happens, there is war tomorrow. because China is never going to allow Taiwan to, and the US knows this, the US will never allow Taiwan to have a referendum.
Right.
So it's not going
But,
to happen.
yeah, but politics, as you know, is not a straight line. I wanted to put all these possibilities because we know what we are facing. It's not a straight line because, on the other hand, what US doesn't want is Taiwan being controlled, even indirectly, by China. That would weaken its hand in the.
But this is precisely why they will never allow her to run a referendum. She runs a referendum, there is a war, she loses immediately, and then Taiwan becomes China.
Well, the problem is, if there is a war, would she lose it? Not
But
necessarily.
60 million and 1 billion. So
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Because invasion, now we go into real things, you know. A war, if there is a war of invasion, landing has historically always failed. There is not a single landing invasion that has been successful. Not even the landing of Normandy, which was done with overwhelming force. Imagine the invasion of, and these were 30 miles from England. These are 130 miles from mainland China. So an invasion would be difficult. Bombing, flattening all Taiwan with missiles, this is possible, but this would be World War III, because if you bomb Taiwan, then you must retaliate. But also, if the other possibility would be a blockade. If they blockade Taiwan, then there would be a counter blockade. But in the meantime, there are lots of other pieces in motion. What I mean is that in this situation, we don't have to think along straight lines, but the Taiwan element is an independent element which has an independent and its own agenda, which doesn't align completely with the United States, and in fact has all interest in getting the United States aligned with Taiwan, not vice versa. And as you know better than me, America is not an authoritarian country. It's not, the American State Department doesn't come to you and tells you, you do this, this and that. There is a dialogue. You go to the State Department and say, we are worried about A, B, C, D. You should do something. And some lobbies are very active and very powerful, influential. The Israeli lobby is notoriously, or famously, the most powerful lobby. The second most powerful lobby in Washington is the Taiwanese lobby. So, no straight lines, just red flags. I'm just putting out some red flags about something that could go wrong there, something that will. Yes, please.
Yes, Taiwan. I worked a lot with Taiwan in the past for a company for the defense industry, so I know a bit about these issues. The newly elected president, she won with 60% of the votes in a competition where nearly 75% of people able to vote went to vote. So it's been the most. She won by the most
absolute majority, yes.
And she did a great thing, I think, in the last couple of days. She went to the Pope, saying about the Chinese pressure, and I think this has been a smart move because she put the pressure on the Pope, who was now trying to connect again with China. So I think she made a smart move from this point of view.
Yes, yes, yes. What you are telling, you are making my point exactly. She is driving her own agenda over the United States, over the agenda of the Pope. The Pope has a different agenda, but she's trying to push everywhere because she feels objectively that if this is a window of opportunity. Of course, the Pope has no interest in supporting her because he has bigger fish to fry, different fish to fry. The United States doesn't have, but it creates waves, embarrassment. And this year will not go on smoothly. I would be surprised, let's put it this way, I would be surprised if it went on smoothly on the Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea front. Too many balls up in the air. So yes, there is a truce. Thanks God there is a truce, and there is no, because truce is also time to think and maybe to step a little bit away from the brink, sort out some other possible solutions. But at the end of the day, there is a core issue. And the core issue, I think, is the Chinese integration in the world economy, which we saw has historic roots, philosophical roots, or whatever. But now I would say there is a real market route, real technical route. That is, if I pass a law in the United States is the biggest country, whatever law is passed in the United States on, say, the use of plastic, this will have huge impact in the world. If I forbid plastic in the United States, and instead of plastic I say cotton should be used, the price of plastic will go down and the price of cotton will go up, with global implication. Everybody will pay or benefit from this American decision. This is true also to a growing degree with China, because it's the second largest economy. However, there is a basic difference between China and the United States. If the American president wants to take such a decision, he has to go through public discussion and open debate. The Congress, the newspapers, the think tanks will be involved, and to say the least, months will take to come to this decision. And in the meantime, everybody in the world, although they cannot vote, they can express their opinion, they can write to whatever, the Washington Times or the Washington Post, saying we are in favor, we are in agreement. They can lobby, but to the very least they can prepare. And so there is, for no company, there is a significant competitive advantage in the American system, because all companies producing plastic or producing cotton are in the same boat as an American company. But China is different. If the president of China decides to switch from plastic to cotton, it can take 2 minutes. It doesn't have to go through a public debate. And this will have a huge impact, which is already bad enough because nobody can prepare. But this is an even worse consequence, which is in the Chinese system, institutionally market, state-owned enterprises may be privy to this process. Therefore, if I am in a Chinese system, an SOE, and I know that Xi Jinping in 2 days is going to pass this new idea, I can short plastic and long cotton and make trillions over everybody else in the world. So it's a huge distortion. It's a huge market distortion. Besides whatever we may think of the ideology, we may like it, we may not like it, democracy, not democracy, but objectively, the connection between market and politics, this connection between market and politics, both murky, the market is not open, the politics is not open, creates a huge distortion in the global markets. This distortion in the global markets is the same distortion of any closed economy. It's the same, you can say it's the same with Vietnam or North Korea or Cuba. But these economies are small. Their impact is very small. China's impact is huge. Therefore, it cannot be just overlooked. So either the world change, or United States, to make a very long story short, change into some new kind of China, or China becomes more like the United States at the end of the day. There is a third way, which...
But the world has changed already. So Trump is there, and therefore somehow it's not true that China and even Xi Jinping can really take decision in 2 minutes. Clearly, internally, he doesn't face
but do you know
restraint.
how long? Yeah.
But then you see that the specific features of the truce that have been reached indicate that, I mean, seemingly the agreement, I'm not an expert on international agreement, but seemingly looking from outside, most of the tariffs are still there. The only concession that China has obtained is not to raise tariffs for the future, and maybe halving to 7.5% tariffs that were 15% over $200 billion, and then they are committed to buy at least $200 billion more. So the constraint is there, it's outside rather than inside, so therefore one might be sort of more optimistic for the world economy thanks to Trump, so to speak. So that the fact that the United States, in spite of, so maybe it's because the United States has become more similar to China, so therefore somehow there's a person in charge who can take decisions through tweeting or maybe affecting the way in which the normal democracy works. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know about Trump, but definitely, no matter what we think of Trump, but American system is much more open. Definitely is open. We can criticize Trump when Trump communicates through tweets. Last time, as far as I know, Xi Jinping never used Twitters, right? So there is no. But what I mean is there is a huge difference. There is a huge difference, and what I mean is something structural. Besides buying and selling so many goods, imposing this tariff or that tariff, is far more structural, and is something at the core of the Chinese system. The core of the Chinese system is that we don't know anything about the decision-making process of the Chinese president. We don't know anything. We only know what they tell us. There is no open, and the rest is just guesswork. There is no open debate in a free press. There is no open debate in Congress. So this creates a situation in which also we are skeptical about the transparency of the American system. We are not born yesterday, as we said. No, we know, but it is as we were to play poker, and you have two cards open close to the vest, but three cards flashed out in the open on the table. And this would be Americans. It's not totally open, but at least 3 cards are there. China, how many cards are on the table? You could argue none. You could argue only 1. Definitely there is a difference, and this difference is a big issue. One big issue in the present friction, let's put it this way. There has been progress, I agree with you, I'm happy there's been progress, but this is a truce, it's not a peace. This cannot last very long. Because the core issue is still there, which is the connection, the lack of transparency of the Chinese market and the lack of transparency of the Chinese political decision-making process. These are core issues which impact all global trade.
Do you think that the Americans can seriously think that they can force the Chinese to change their political system? Doesn't mean you can hope it happens, but the idea.
I didn't see any claim in this direction. The Chinese.
Well, when they say you should stop the state-owned enterprises because they upset competition, you go in that direction, right?
Yeah, but if you want, in a diplomatic system, in a diplomatic way, they are repeating what Xi Jinping was saying, has been saying since 2013. He said, he came to power saying, I want to reform state-owned enterprises. So the Americans say, well, we are saying the same. However, is really the same? We don't know. But what I want to address now is, and underline here, is that it's not just something that can be solved by agreeing, by a simple agreement, and you buy a few million tons of grain, a few million tons of pork. There is something more radical at stake, and it's not just simply the opening of the market. And this is my final point, and then that is, Chinese learn that if they have an open economy, an open full convertibility of the renminbi, but a rigid, closed political system like the Philippines or Indonesia had in 1998, then a financial crisis can create social upheaval and topple a government. So in order to have an open economy which would undergo naturally possible outflow and inflow of money, they need to have a more flexible political system, so that if there is a social and political crisis, they will replace the prime minister, have new elections, and start anew, more simply. Yes, please. Thank you.
We talk about the 200 billion US dollar for the trading agreement which China and America signed recently.
Yes.
And there's comment that this amount is beyond China's capacity, the domestic capacity. So this remind me the topic we mentioned yesterday about the Made in China 2025. So for me, this decision of signing this agreement and also obviously the goal is contradict
Absolutely.
each other. So I would like to know your opinion about if you are still optimistic about China's economic
yeah.
years later, or
I think honestly, from what we see, what we have been seeing in the past year and a half, we can draw a few conclusions in the future. First, I would say, because you mentioned the 2025 plan is disrupted. Because now in a way it is accelerated, they are accelerating because they're afraid that sensitive companies like Huawei or ZTE will be under pressure from Americans and sales of chips, so they will accelerate. There will be delinking of the Chinese economy from the global economy, but then if they delink the technology, the Chinese technology, then can you reach the goal of 2025? Maybe yes, maybe no. Difficulties, we have the 2022 Party Congress, very important. And with the 20th, we still don't know what will come out. We know that Xi Jinping will stay there, but then what will happen with the rest of the Politburo, with the Central Committee, lots of questions. But still, this is very far away. We don't know what will happen this year, and with so many balls in the air. So 2025 is far away. And the second thing is that de facto is the end of one country, two system, because Hong Kong is not working. Imagine what can work with Taiwan. So in theory, China should rethink everything, because it underestimated the United States. It underestimated the challenge it is facing, because this is not just a short-term challenge, it is a challenge of 500 years. It's not a challenge of 5 years, not 50 years, 500 years. In 500 years, China, with the Ming Dynasty, with the Manchu Dynasty, with the Communist Party, make the same mistake. This is tragic. Something deep has to go on, because otherwise we all facing big troubles. Because if China has troubles because of the size, the whole world will have trouble. So can America step back? Impossible, because the hardship, the problems at the core of China's problem are not just bilateral, they are not just with the United States, but as we saw yesterday, briefly, are with the rest of the global trade system. So, very difficult challenges. Yes, you want to say that?
So does it also mean that it's not a good time for like European companies and more investment into China in the next coming 1 year?
This is the investment is a different thing. Yeah, investment is a different thing, because as Rothschild famously said, there is blood in the street, then you do 3 things: buy, buy, buy. So there is war, there's prospect of war, maybe there is a good opportunity for business, but of course there are business in wars and business of peace. Different kinds of business. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
I have a question about Huawei.
Yes.
So if...
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes. My name is Fritz. I'm an exchange student from the US.
Okay.
You mentioned Huawei. If the US kind of Trump-driven rivalry with Huawei continues to build, and we do get kind of a tech wall between China and the US, where we really have like separate telecommunications systems, do you think that ultimately would hurt the US or China more?
It's hard to say, because we don't know, but definitely there is this trend. The United States made it clear they don't want Huawei. Not only they don't want Huawei, they don't want their allies to use Huawei. Simply put, by some think tanks in New York, because the 5G is a complex system which runs at the same time people's business and also military business. So, you know, the guidance system for missiles or airplanes or whatever can use this civilian platform of 5G, and there, when military is at stake, the real issue is you have to trust the guy next to you. So you don't trust him, you can. There is no way of using it. So it's very simple. America doesn't use it. The rest of countries close to the United States will not be able to use it. Very simple, because they would delink say Italy or Germany or England from the United States. They can try to bargain, do something, but I don't think at the end you can delink. But of course, you will have a situation, and we are already driving towards a situation. There was a piece on the New York Times today I was mentioning, that since America is thinking of delinking its technology and carving a space around China, China will develop its own technology. And so you can have, as you had with the USSR during the Cold War, two separate technological developments, which could be very risky.
It was not very efficient because the size of the railroad were different.
The size of the, yes.
You had to change trains.
You had to change trains, and it was because they were afraid of attack, and so in this case, yes, you will have a delink of the two. You are seeing a possible already move to delink it, and this delinking has, in theory, unfathomable consequences.
Yeah.
Unfathomable consequences. Yes, please.
Sorry, so would this just would this create a more kind of divided world? Like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but somewhere I read that China was even looking at developing their own internet or something, or their own, like, or maybe I read it wrong.
Yeah, this is not actually true. What is happening, and is happening even more, I mean, this process is growing pace. They are again carving their space. They are separating. There is the great firewall separating China's internet from the internet of the rest of the world, and this trend could get even greater traction. But let me take a step back. I'm not saying there will be war. I'm saying there could be war. Now we have 1 year of truce. Let's think that maybe this year of truce will help us all to find a feasible way to avert a possible war. But we have to have in mind that yes, a possible war is a reality, is not far-fetched anymore. We are closer to a world war, closer than we ever were since the end of the Cold War in practically the 80s.
The only hope was that it was a reality 1 year ago as well.
Yes, and
so therefore we are still here.
No, exactly.
And we hope it will not.
Absolutely. But what we saw is that 1 year ago I was saying these things, and I was right?
Thank you very much, Francesco.
Thank you.